These are the fighter pilots of Imperial Japan who may have been the deadliest airmen of the Second World War, and whose exact victory totals no historian on Earth can confirm. This is the story of how the most feared fighter force in the Pacific produced men like Tetsuzo Iwamoto, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Saburo Sakai, and then destroyed the record of what they actually did. Everything that follows rests on one fact. The Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army never operated a formal individual victory credit system, not at the start of the war, not in the middle of it, and not at the end. When a Japanese fighter unit came home from a fight, the victories went into the ledger of the air group rather than the ledger of the pilot. That convention came from British Royal Navy and Royal Air Force practice. It was applied with real consistency, and the consequence is that the men Western audiences call Japan's greatest aces carry no official scores at all. Every figure you have ever read for a Japanese ace is an estimate. Tetsuzo Iwamoto's war diary claims 202 individual victories, 26 shared, and 22 unconfirmed. Academic reconstruction by the historians Ikehiko Hata and Yasuo Izawa put his real figure at roughly 80. Nishizawa told his last commanding officer that he had achieved 86 or 87. Writing for a United States Marine Corps monograph, the American naval historian Barrett Tillman stated flatly that he did not believe 87, that he might believe 30, and that a definitive total will probably never be determined. That gap is not a footnote. That gap is the subject. Inside it sit a genuinely extraordinary generation of pilots, a fighter aircraft designed by a man named Jiro Horikoshi that traded a pilot's survival for a pilot's range, a training system so selective that it consumed 240,000 boys to produce 24,000 combat aviators, and one institutional decision so quietly catastrophic that a survivor named it as the reason all of his friends died. This is what actually happened to Japan's fighter aces, what the records genuinely support, and which of the famous stories fall apart the moment anyone checks them. Start with the archive, because the archive is where the mythology breaks. Roughly 70% of Imperial Japanese Navy unit combat reports survived the war, and they sit today in the Japan Defense Agency's War History Holdings. That sounds like a rich record, and in some ways the record is rich. Most of those documents, though, contain only 3 things: a summary of the combat, the names of the pilots who flew it, and the total number of victories claimed by the unit. Individual tallies do not appear. There is no column for who shot down what. When a historian assembles a figure for a Japanese ace, that historian is reconstructing. Hata and Izawa built their estimates from unit records cross-checked against personal diaries, wartime newspaper accounts, and interviews with the men who lived. Careful work and unavoidably inference. Compare that to the American system, where a claim was filed, assessed, and formally credited, which produced the clean numbers that allow Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire to be ranked against each other down to the single aircraft. The Americans built a scoreboard. The Japanese built a war machine that did not believe in scoreboards. There is a principle in statistics that anyone who has ever argued about performance metrics will recognize immediately. The number you get depends less on the underlying reality than on what somebody decided to count and who they allowed to do the counting. Change the denominator, and the result changes without a single fact on the ground moving at all. Japanese aerial victory figures are the purest historical example of that problem available anywhere. The pilots did not lie in any simple sense. The counting system that would have contradicted them never existed, so the numbers drifted, and 80 years later the drift is permanent. Ikehiko Hata and Yasuo Izawa, working alongside the British historian Christopher Shores, produced what remains the definitive English-language reconstruction of the subject, a volume on Japanese Naval Air Force fighter units and their aces published by the Naval Institute Press and later expanded. Barrett Tillman assessed the Hata and Izawa work as about as good as anyone is likely to get on this subject in English. That is the ceiling, not certainty, but the best available reconstruction, which means every number in this account arrives with a warning attached, and the warnings are the honest part. The reason those pilots were so dangerous in 1941 and 1942 comes down to a selection process that ran close to inhuman. The Imperial Japanese Navy's preparatory flight training program, the Yokurin, opened in 1930, and it took civilian boys aged roughly 14 and a half to 17, chosen by nationwide competitive examination. Across the full run of the program from 1930 to 1945, the Yokorin Peace Memorial Museum at Ami in Ibaraki records that some 240,000 boys enlisted, and that around 24,000 of them completed the curriculum as combat pilots and reached the front. 10%. That is the through rate across the life of the program. John Lundstrom, the American naval historian whose work on the early carrier war remains a standard reference, described pre-war Japanese naval training as short and brutal. 7 to 9 months, designed deliberately to wash out large numbers of candidates, with the pressure falling hardest on enlisted men. In some pre-war years, the selection ran so tight that no more than about 100 pilot candidates were accepted at all. What the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service bought with that brutality was flight hours. None of the naval pilots who flew against Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 carried fewer than roughly 600 hours in the air, and many of the flight leaders held more than 1,500. Minoru Genda, the officer who planned the Pearl Harbor strike and who would command a fighter group in the final year of the war, had logged over 3,000. Those are not wartime numbers. Those are airline captain numbers, held by men in their 20s flying single-seat fighters. A great many of them had already been shooting at people. Iwamoto and the future home defense ace Sadaki Akamatsu both saw action in China from 1937 onward. When the Pacific War opened, Japan fielded a fighter arm built largely out of veterans with years of combat behind them, against opponents who in many cases had never fired at a moving aircraft. Hold that 10% figure, because the system that produced it had no reverse gear. A pipeline tune that tightly delivers excellence at low volume, and it cannot surge. Nobody in the Japanese naval establishment appears to have seriously modeled what happens when the front starts consuming those men faster than the schools can manufacture them. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a fighter specification that most engineers would have called impossible. Known as the 12 Sure requirement, it asked for a single aircraft that was simultaneously fast, extremely agile, heavily armed, and capable of enormous range. The specific demands ran to a top speed around 310 miles per hour at roughly 13,000 feet, a climb to 9,840 feet in 3.5 minutes, an endurance of 6 to 8 hours at economical cruise with a drop tank, and an armament of 2 wing-mounted 20mm Type 99 cannon plus 2 cowl-mounted 7.7mm machine guns. Jiro Horikoshi, Mitsubishi's chief designer, met that specification the only way it could be met. Weight came out until nothing remained to remove. Horikoshi omitted armor plating entirely, not reduced it, omitted it. Fuel tanks went in unprotected, with no self-sealing layer. For the airframe, he chose Sumitomo Extra Superduralumin, an aluminium-zinc alloy that was exceptionally strong for its weight and also brittle, and he ran a single continuous wing spar through the structure to save every possible pound of fittings and joints. The result first flew on the 1st of April 1939, entered service in July 1940, and appeared in combat over China that same year. 10,939 Zeros were eventually built, making it the most produced Japanese aircraft of the war. Mitsubishi delivered 3,879 land-based examples. Nakajima delivered more than 6,200, and a further 327 were completed as twin-float seaplane versions. The same philosophy governed the Army's fighters, the Nakajima Ki-27 and the Ki-43 Hayabusa. Light, agile, long-legged, and structurally unforgiving of damage. Anyone who follows top-flight motorsport understands the trade Horikoshi made, because the same trade gets made every season in Formula One. Lightness is the single most valuable commodity in a performance machine, improving acceleration, cornering, braking, and fuel consumption all at once, which is why engineers strip material until they reach the regulatory floor and then argue about where the floor sits. The reason motorsport stops stripping is that the sport imposes a hard survival cell that cannot be traded away. Horikoshi worked to a specification with no such floor. Every gram of armor was a gram of range surrendered. The Imperial Japanese Navy wanted the range, and so the survival cell came out. For 18 months, that bargain looked like genius. What it actually was a decision to make the pilot the expendable component in a system that could not replace pilots. Before Pearl Harbor, before Rabaul, before any of the names Western audiences know, the highest-scoring fighter pilot in Japanese history had already lived and died in an undeclared border war that most people outside Japan and Russia have never heard of. Between May and September 1939, Japanese and Soviet forces fought a large, brutal, and officially unacknowledged conflict along the Manchurian and Mongolian frontier, known to the Japanese as Namenhin and to the Soviets as Kokengol. Months of intense air combat came with it. Hiramichi Shinohara, born on the 1st of August 1913, flew the Nakajima Ki-27 with the 11th Sentai of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. In roughly 3 months of fighting, Shinohara accumulated 58 credited victories, and on the 27th of June 1939, over Tamsak Bulak, the Army pilot claimed 11 aircraft shot down in a single day, which stands as the Japanese single-day record. Death came for Shinohara on the 27th of August 1939 at the age of 26. Every one of those victories was scored in an aircraft with a fixed undercarriage. 58 sits higher than the scholarly reconstruction assigns to Nishizawa, higher than the reconstruction assigns to Iwamoto, and higher than any total credibly attached to Saburo Sakai. By the numbers most commonly cited, the highest-scoring Japanese fighter pilot of the modern era died more than 2 years before Japan attacked the United States, in a war Japan lost, against an enemy Japan then avoided for 6 years. There is something in the Shinohara story that rewards sitting still with it. The Namenhin defeat convinced elements of the Japanese army that the Soviet Union was a fight not worth having, which pushed Japanese strategic attention south, toward the resource-rich European colonies, and toward the American fleet standing between Japan and them. The air battles that produced Japan's highest-scoring fighter pilot helped set the country on the road to the war that killed almost every pilot who came after him. On the 7th of December 1941, Tetsuzo Iwamoto flew from the deck of the carrier Zuikaku against Pearl Harbor, having already spent 4 years fighting in China. 3 days later, on the 10th of December 1941, a naval fighter pilot named Saburo Sakai shot down a B-17 flown by Colin Kelly, the first B-17 lost in the war. On the 8th of December 1941, the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa made its combat debut over Malaya. The unit that would become the most storied fighter formation in Japanese naval aviation had been activated on the 1st of October 1941. The Tainan Air Group, or Tainan Kokutai, existed for barely 13 months before disbanding on the 1st of November 1942, and inside that span it accumulated a concentration of talent with few equals in the history of air warfare. Sakai flew in it, Nishizawa flew in it, and so did Toshio Oda and Junichi Sasai. April 1942 took the Tainan Air Group forward to La, in New Guinea. What followed over the next several months is both the high-water mark of Japanese fighter aviation and the beginning of its destruction, and those are not separate events. Consider the arithmetic facing the Allies. Japanese fighter pilots arriving in the South Pacific in early 1942 carried 600 hours minimum, years of combat experience in many cases, and flew an aircraft that could turn inside anything the Allies put up while reaching targets the Allies assumed lay out of range. Against that, in those opening months, Allied fighter squadrons frequently fielded pilots who had never seen combat, flying tactics designed for a war that had not yet arrived. The kill ratios of early 1942 are not evidence of a superweapon. They are evidence of what happens when a professional veteran force meets an unprepared one. 3 names dominate the Tainan Air Group's reputation. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, born on the 27th of January 1920, is generally regarded as the finest natural pilot Japan produced, and his nickname in the South Pacific was the Devil of Rabaul. Contemporaries described a man who was sickly and withdrawn on the ground and completely transformed in the air. His own claim, given to his last commanding officer, ran to 86 or 87 victories. Post-war accounts have attached figures as high as 147 and 103 to Nishizawa. and both of those higher numbers are regarded as inaccurate. Junichi Sasai differed in almost every respect. An officer, well-born, known as the Prince of Rabaul, and by the accounts of the men who served under him, genuinely beloved by them. On the 4th of May 1942, Sasai became an ace by shooting down 3 P-39 Airacobras in approximately 20 seconds, and his career total is reckoned at around 27. Toshio Oda, the third of the group, carries a figure of roughly 34. Any risk manager looking at the Tainan Air Group's roster in mid-1942 would have identified the problem instantly, because it is the same problem that makes modern supply chain analysts nervous when a critical component has exactly one supplier. Concentration produces spectacular efficiency right up to the moment it produces catastrophic failure. Japan had concentrated an irreplaceable fraction of its combat aviation expertise into a small number of forward units, flown those units continuously against a rapidly strengthening enemy, and built no mechanism to extract and preserve the expertise before it was destroyed. The Tainan Air Group did not fail. It was consumed exactly as designed. Sasai was killed on the 26th of August 1942, credited to the American Marine ace Marion Carl. Oda was killed on the 21st of October 1942. Between August and November of 1942, the Tainan Air Group lost 32 pilots killed. 13 months. That was the whole life of the unit. Here this account has to stop and deal with its own sources, because almost every famous anecdote about Japanese fighter pilots in the English-speaking world traces back to a single book, and that book is a problem. Saburo Sakai's memoir, published in English in 1957 under the title Samurai, was not written by Saburo Sakai. The American aviation writer Martin Kaiden assembled it, working from interviews conducted by the Japanese journalist Fred Saito. Henry Sakata, the historian who has done more than anyone writing in English to check the Japanese record against the legends, has stated bluntly that the American edition purports to be Sakai's autobiography and is no such thing. The book claims 64 victories for Sakai. Analysis against Japanese records indicates 28 aerial victories, including shared claims, and Kaiden is understood to have inflated the number for publicity. Sakai addressed the discrepancy himself. In a 1998 interview, the veteran pilot conceded that the figure of 64 was made up, possibly as an allusion to the roughly 60 duels of the swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, and then added that the true number was not far off. That is itself a complicated statement, and it should be left complicated. More seriously, in 1985 Sakai told Henry Sakata that a specific and dramatic episode in the book, a night interception of AB-29, in August 1945 flown alongside an officer named as Ensign Jiro Kawachi, was, in Sakai's own words, totally false. Sakai stated that he never flew at night, and that there was no Ensign Jiro Kawachi. This matters far beyond one book. The samurai memoir is the origin point for the entire Western image of the Japanese fighter pilot as a chivalric warrior figure, the sky samurai of this video's title, and that image is not fabricated from nothing. It was shaped for an American paperback market in the 1950s by an American writer with a commercial interest in making it vivid, and it has been recycled through documentaries and books and videos ever since without the caveat traveling alongside it. So the rule for the rest of this account is simple. Where a story comes from the memoir, and only from the memoir, that will be said out loud. Which brings us to one of the best stories in the whole subject. In May 1942, according to the memoir, Nishizawa, Sakai, and Oda heard an Australian radio broadcast and answered it by flying a formation aerobatic display, sometimes called the Danse Macabre, over the Allied airfield area near La and Port Moresby. The story concludes with an Australian thank you note delivered to the Japanese field, complimenting the performance. That episode is memoir-derived. It should be attributed that way, and it should not be presented as documented fact. What can be said with more confidence is why the story took hold. Nishizawa, Oda, and Sakai were, by every account including hostile ones, exceptional airmen operating at the outer limit of what the Zero could do, in a theater where both sides sat close enough to see each other's fields. The story is plausible in a way that pure invention usually is not. The story is also exactly what a 1950s paperback needed. Both things are true, and neither one resolves the other. On the 4th of June 1942, returning from a raid on Dutch harbor in the Aleutians, a Japanese naval pilot named Tadayoshi Koga put his damaged A-6M2 down on Akutan Island. The ground looked solid, and the ground was bog. The aircraft flipped, Koga was killed, and the airframe survived almost intact. A United States Navy recovery party reached the wreck around the 10th of July 1942. The Zero was shipped out, repaired, and flight tested. The standard telling of what followed holds that the Akutan Zero handed the United States the key to defeating Japanese air power. The Japanese General Masatake Okumiya later wrote that the loss of that aircraft was no less serious than the Japanese defeat at Midway, and that line has appeared in nearly every account since. Here is the more careful version. First, the Akutan aircraft was not the first intact Zero the Allies captured, because a Tainan Air Group example had already been taken in China in November 1941, 7 months earlier. Second, what the flight testing produced was confirmation rather than revelation. Testing established firmly that the Zero rolled more slowly to the right than to the left at high speed, and it confirmed the absence of armor. Quoted in Jim Reardon's research on the aircraft, the Marine ace Kenneth Walsh described the practical value in exactly those terms, saying that from information that came from Koga Zero, he knew the fighter rolled more slowly to the right, and that if he had not known which way to turn or roll, he would probably have rolled to his left. That is a real and useful tactical edge. It is not a war-winning secret. The right modern analogy is not a stolen blueprint. It is the public disclosure of a known vulnerability in widely deployed software. The weakness in the Zero ran structural and permanent, baked into the design decisions Horikoshi made in 1937, and it could not be patched without abandoning the specification the aircraft existed to satisfy. The Akutan recovery did not create the vulnerability. Recovery documented it precisely enough that thousands of ordinary pilots, rather than a handful of exceptional ones, could exploit it reliably. That is how asymmetries actually collapse, not through one dramatic breach, but through the industrialization of a weakness everybody half knew about. The captured aircraft itself was destroyed in an accident in February 1945, when a helldiver taxiing on the same field sliced into it. The deeper reason Japanese fighter superiority evaporated has almost nothing to do with captured airframes. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized individual maneuver and the classic turning dogfight, and that doctrine was correct for the equipment. The Zero and the Ki-43 could outturn anything the Allies flew, so a doctrine built around turning was a doctrine built around the Japanese advantage. The American answer was to refuse the fight on those terms. John Thatch, a naval aviator, developed a mutual support maneuver universally known as the Thatch Weave, in which two aircraft cross their flight paths so that a fighter attacking one of them presents itself head-on to the other. Its combat debut came on the 4th of June 1942, at Midway, the same day Koga Zero went into the Akutan Bog. Alongside it, American pilots increasingly adopted energy tactics, diving in fast, firing once, and climbing away rather than staying to turn. The effect of that shift states easily and countered hard. Air combat converted from a contest between individual pilots, which favored Japan, into a contest between formations and systems, which favored the United States. A superb Japanese pilot in a turning fight against one American was a lethal proposition. The same pilot against two Americans working a rehearsed pattern was fighting a machine rather than a man. Here is the piece that usually gets left out. Doctrine like the Thatch Weave rewards training and discipline over individual brilliance, which means it can be taught at scale to pilots of average ability. Japan's doctrine could not be taught at scale because it depended on the exceptional airmanship that Japan's training pipeline produced only in small numbers and was already beginning to lose. The tactical asymmetry and the manpower asymmetry were the same problem wearing two different faces. On the 7th of August 1942, American forces landed at Guadalcanal, and Japanese aircraft flew against the landings from Rabaul. Across the 2 days of the 7th and 8th of August, the Japanese lost 36 aircraft, and the Americans lost 19. Somewhere in that fighting, Saburo Sakai was shot in the head. The wound blinded Sakai in the right eye, and left the left side of his body partially paralyzed. Sources differ on whether the injury occurred on the 7th or the 8th of August, and the flight distance that followed appears variously as 560 nautical miles or 640 statute miles. Consistent across every account is the shape of what he did next. The wounded pilot flew back to Rabaul, roughly 4 hours and 47 minutes in the air, half-blind, partially paralyzed, in an unpressurized single-seat fighter with no autopilot and no navigational assistance beyond what he could work out for himself. Sakai landed, delivered his mission report, and then collapsed. Nishizawa is reported to have driven him to the surgeon. Surgery followed, conducted without anesthetic. Sakai then returned to combat, flying operationally over Iwo Jima and in the defense of the home islands with permanently impaired vision. That flight is the reason Saburo Sakai's name outlived almost every other Japanese ace in Western memory, and unlike the Night B-29 story, it is well corroborated. Read carefully. The flight also describes a system in serious trouble. A pilot with that much accumulated experience should never have been in a position where flying himself home half-conscious was the only option available. Behind him sat no rescue infrastructure worth the name. In front of him sat no armor. And the reason a man in his condition returned to operational flying at all is the subject of everything that follows. This is the center of the whole story, and it is not about aircraft. The United States rotated combat experienced pilots home. Richard Bong, Thomas McGuire, and Joe Foss all cycled out of the combat theater into training or public duties, which meant the most experienced men in the American system were periodically removed from danger and pointed at the next generation, and hard-won combat knowledge propagated backward through the training establishment continuously. Japan largely did not do this. The best Japanese pilots stayed at the front until somebody killed them. Sakai named it himself. Speaking to the Associated Press in 1945 and quoted later in his New York Times obituary, the veteran said that there were only a few Japanese experts, that the American aces were sent home as instructors, and that the top Japanese pilots, because of the shortage of manpower, were left in combat to die. That is not hindsight from a historian. That is the assessment of a man who watched it happen to everyone he flew with. The numbers show the consequence with brutal clarity. By 1945, Japanese Army pilot training had fallen to roughly 60 to 70 flight hours, while American Army training held at a minimum of around 200 hours and United States Navy minimums ran to roughly 400. Set that against the 600-hour floor among the naval pilots of December 1941, and the collapse reads as total, inside 4 years, inside the same organization. Two forces drove it. The front killed veterans faster than the schools could replace them, and the naval blockade strangled the fuel supply that training flights required. A student pilot cannot accumulate hours on aviation spirit that does not exist. Every organization that has ever lost its senior people faster than it could document what they knew has run this exact failure mode. The expertise does not live in the manuals. Expertise lives in individuals, and it transfers only through deliberate contact between the experienced and the inexperienced. An institution that keeps its most knowledgeable people permanently at the sharp end, on the entirely reasonable grounds that they are the most effective people it has, is spending its capital stock to pay its running costs. That looks like maximum efficiency for exactly as long as the capital lasts. Then the capital is gone and nothing stands behind it. Japan's fighter arm did not degrade gradually. It fell off a cliff because the mechanism that would have cushioned the fall had already been fed into the fighting. Return now to the man with the largest claim in Japanese aviation history. Tetsuzo Iwamoto flew in China from 1937, launched against Pearl Harbor from the Zuikaku, and fought through the South Pacific Campaign. His war diary claims 202 individual victories, 26 shared, and 22 unconfirmed, and grand totals of around 254 appear when China's service and ground claims get folded in. Research by Izawa and Hada, published in 1971, estimated Iwamoto's actual figure at about 80, or somewhat more than 87 depending on the accounting, with the most commonly cited scholarly figure sitting around 80. In December 1993, Izawa wrote that Iwamoto was virtually the top ace of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Notice what Ozawa did and did not say. 202 received no endorsement. What he said was that even after reconstruction cut the figure by more than half, Iwamoto still stands at or near the top. The mechanism behind the gap becomes visible in the lost records. Take the day in early January 1944 when the American ace Gregory Boyington was shot down. Japanese naval air groups claimed 5 Corsairs destroyed by the 253rd and a further 3 Corsairs and 1 Hellcat by the 204th. Actual American losses that day came to 2 Corsairs, Boyington and his wingman George Ashman. 9 claimed, 2 lost. That ratio is not evidence of fraud. Multiple pilots firing at the same aircraft in a fast, confused, three-dimensional fight will honestly report multiple kills, and with no adjudicating authority to reconcile the claims, all of them stand. Every air force in the war overclaimed. Japan's distinction is that it possessed no institutional process for correcting the overclaim afterwards, which leaves an uncomfortable position that this account will hold rather than resolve. Iwamoto's 202 is almost certainly not a true count of aircraft destroyed. Iwamoto was also, by the judgment of the very historians who cut his number down, probably the deadliest fighter pilot Japan produced. Both statements carry support, and neither cancels the other. Death came to Iwamoto on the 20th of May 1955 at Masuda, at the age of 38, from sepsis following a series of surgeries. Japanese language accounts, including a postscript written by his wife, record his last words to her as a wish that when he recovered, he wanted to fly again. On the 14th of September 1943, the naval pilot Takeo Okamura claimed 10 aircraft shot down in a single day, believed to be the highest single-day claim by any Imperial Japanese Navy fighter pilot. Vice Admiral Junichi Kasaka arranged for Okamura to receive a ceremonial sword in recognition. Okamura was killed before the presentation took place. That is the entire episode, and its compression is the point. In the Japanese Naval Air Service of late 1943, the interval between a career-defining performance and death frequently ran shorter than the interval required to organize a ceremony. Almost everything popular history says about Japanese fighter pilots is naval history. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force fought a parallel war with its own aircraft, its own units, and its own aces, and that war is systematically undercovered. Satoshi Anabuki stood as the leading Army ace of the Pacific War, with around 39 victories officially credited to him. His own claims run to roughly 51, and the figure given in his memoir is 53. Most of those came in the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, an aircraft built on the same light, agile, unarmored philosophy as the Zero. Anabuki survived the war, later flew helicopters with the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force, and died in 2005. Tadeo Kato commanded the 64th Sentai, a unit so identified with its commander that it became known as Kato's Falcons. Kato was killed on the 22nd of May 1942 over the Bay of Bengal. Yasuhiko Kuro is reckoned at around 30. Then there is the pilot whose specialty was the hardest target in the sky. Isamu Kashiide flew the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, a twin-engine heavy fighter, with the 4th Sentai. Kashiide claimed 26 B-29 superfortresses, of which 7 were later confirmed, inside a total of around 33 claims overall. His method was the head-on attack, using the Toryu's heavy armament to hit the bomber from the front, where closing speeds ran highest and the defensive gunnery had the least time to respond. Consider what that required. A B-29 flew pressurized, defended by remote-controlled turrets, high and fast, and typically in formation. Attacking one head-on in a twin-engine fighter meant accepting a closing rate that gave the attacker seconds of firing time and no margin for error in the breakaway. Kashiide survived the war and died in May 2003. Not every Japanese ace fitted the disciplined warrior template, and the most conspicuous exception broke almost every rule the Imperial Japanese Navy had while outliving nearly all of his contemporaries. Sadaki Akamatsu was officially credited with 27 victories. Combat in China had occupied him from the late 1930s, and Henry Sakida confirmed that Akamatsu accumulated more than 8,000 flight hours, a figure that dwarfs almost anyone else in this story and would look respectable on a career airline pilot. Akamatsu was also a notorious heavy drinker with a reputation for insubordination that would have ended most careers in most air forces. Flying the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden in the defense of Tokyo, an interceptor also designed by Jiro Horikoshi, Akamatsu came through the entire war unwounded. Death came for Akamatsu on the 22nd of February 1980. Those 8,000 hours are the explanation, and they undercut the romantic reading of Japanese air combat rather neatly. The man who survived was not the most disciplined, the most self-sacrificing, or the most ideologically committed. Akamatsu was the one with the most time in the air. Before the last act, the numbers that made the outcome inevitable regardless of how well anyone flew. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, in its summary report on the Pacific War published in 1946, put total Japanese aircraft production for the Pacific War period at roughly 65,300. Broader compilations covering the full span from 1939 to 1945 give a figure closer to 76,320. American production across that same broad span ran between roughly 296,000 and 355,000 aircraft, the range depending on whether trainers and every type get counted. Reduce that to a single comparison and it stops being abstract. In 1944 alone, the United States built more aircraft, in the region of 96,000, than Japan produced across the entire war. The Strategic Bombing Survey also recorded the shape of the Japanese effort over time. Production averaged 642 aircraft per month across the first 9 months of the Pacific War and rose to a peak of 2,572 per month in September 1944. That second figure deserves a moment, because it contradicts the usual assumption. Japanese aircraft production did not collapse early. It quadrupled, and it peaked in the autumn of 1944, 3 months after the Marianas disaster and less than a year before the surrender, which points at the real constraint. By late 1944, Japan was building aircraft faster than at any point in its history and losing the war in the air anyway, because the limiting factor had stopped being airframes. 10,939 Zeros came off the lines, more than 6,200 of them from Nakajima rather than from the design's parent firm Mitsubishi. The factories delivered. What no factory could deliver was the 600 hours of flight time that made a pilot of 1941 dangerous, or the veterans who might have taught it, or the aviation fuel to fly the lessons in. An air force is not its aircraft. Japan proved that from both directions inside 4 years. On the 19th and 20th of June 1944, the Japanese carrier force made its last attempt at a decisive fleet action, and the result gave the English language a phrase. On the 19th of June, roughly 350 of the more than 370 attacking Japanese carrier aircraft were shot down. World War II database records 429 Japanese aircraft destroyed that day against 29 American losses. The Naval History and Heritage Command summary of the battle as a whole records that the United States Navy had 109 killed in action and lost 123 aircraft, whereas the Japanese lost nearly 600 aircraft, 2 fleet carriers, a light carrier, 2 oilers, and nearly 3,000 pilots and sailors. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot usually gets presented as a demonstration of American aircraft superiority, and the Hellcat certainly features in it. The more accurate reading is that it demonstrated the training collapse described earlier, delivered all at once. The pilots flying those aircraft were not the men of the Tainan Air Group. Those men were already dead, and had been for 18 months. The aviators of June 1944 came out of a shortened, fuel-starved pipeline, and they were sent against radar-directed interception, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, and a defending fighter force with a functioning rotation system feeding combat experience back into its schools. Institutions rarely fail at the point where the underlying decision was made. Failure arrives later, at the moment the accumulated buffer runs out, which is why postmortems so often identify a catastrophic single day when the actual cause is a policy that ran unexamined for years. The decision not to rotate veteran pilots home was made and remade in 1942 and 1943 for defensible short-term reasons every time. The bill arrived across a single morning in June 1944, and by then nothing could be done about it, because the people who might have taught the replacements had been dead for 2 years. By October 1944, the Japanese Naval Air Arm had begun organized suicide attacks, and the surviving veteran fighter pilots drew the job of escorting them. On the 25th of October 1944, the first official kamikaze mission was flown by the Shikishima unit under Lieutenant Yukio Seki, an attack associated with the sinking of the American escort carrier USS St. Lo. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa flew top cover for it. Nishizawa, the Devil of Rabaul, the finest natural pilot Japan produced, spent one of his last operational flights shepherding young men to a deliberate death and then flying home alone. The following day, on the 26th of October 1944, Nishizawa was killed. Nishizawa was not flying that day, and he died as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft, intercepted by American Navy Hellcats in the Philippines near Mindoro, with the most likely victor being Lieutenant Junior Grade Harold Newell. Even the type of aircraft he died in remains uncertain in the sources, reported variously as a Nakajima Ki-49 or another transport type. 24 years old, and he died as cargo. Several senior aces requested kamikaze assignment and were refused on the grounds that they were too valuable to expend. Naoshi Kano was denied repeatedly for exactly that reason. There is a bleak institutional logic in that, and it deserves stating plainly. The same organization that had spent 2 years refusing to withdraw its best pilots from combat in order to preserve them now refused to let those pilots die on the grounds that they were irreplaceable. The conclusion was correct. It arrived approximately 2 years too late to matter. Saburo Sakai, across his long post-war life, condemned the suicide program as a brutal waste of young lives. On the 25th of December 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy formed the 343rd Air Group under Minoru Genda, the officer who had planned the Pearl Harbor strike. Its purpose was to reconcentrate the surviving veteran fighter pilots into a single elite formation flying the best aircraft Japan had left, the Kawanishi N-1K-2J Shurden-kai. Genda was attempting, in the last months of the war, to rebuild deliberately what the Tainan Air Group had been by accident. Naoshi Kano flew in it, and so did Shoichi Sugita. Kano's squadron within the group named itself the Shinsengumi, after the 19th century samurai police corps, which is one of the very few places in this whole subject where the samurai framing comes from the Japanese pilots themselves rather than from Western publishers. On the 19th of March 1945, the 343rd fought its major action over Kure, flying from Matsuyama. One detail in that unit's practice closes the circle on this entire subject. Victory markings in the 343rd were painted on the aircraft rather than awarded to the pilot. Sugita's assigned Shurden-kai eventually carried 16 marks, and those marks accumulated after the aircraft passed to other pilots, including Kano. The scoreboard, when it finally appeared, belonged to the machine. Shoichi Sugita was born on the 1st of July 1924. His victory total is informally reckoned at around 70, though at least one secondary compilation puts his record near 120 by January 1945, a figure that should be treated with caution against the lower reckoning. Sugita was killed on the 15th of April 1945, caught taking off at Kanoya at the age of 20. Naoshi Kano, credited with 25 confirmed victories, and who on the 27th of October 1944 claimed 12 Hellcats in a single action, was killed on the 1st of August 1945 off Yakushima. Japan surrendered 14 days later, on the 15th of August 1945. Set the dates side by side, and the shape of the thing becomes unmistakable. Sasai, August 1942. Oda, October 1942. Okamura, 1943. Nishizawa, October 1944. Sugita, April 1945. Kano, August 1945, 2 weeks from the end. The men who were supposed to be too valuable to lose were lost in sequence, in order, until almost none of them remained. Two stories that appear constantly in popular accounts of Japanese fighter pilots do not survive checking, and correcting them is the most useful thing this account can do. The first is the claim that the Japanese pilot Masajiro Kawato shot down the American Marine ace Gregory Boyington. Kawato maintained this for decades, and it's circulated widely in the English-language press. It is not supported. A former president of the Japan National Defense Agency described the claim as groundless and without a basis in fact. Unit records place Kawato flying overhead cover rather than engaged in the action on the day in question, and Henry Sakai documented the debunking in detail. Kawato died in December 2001 of intestinal cancer. The second myth runs larger and softer, and it is the one this entire account has been arguing against. It holds that the Zero was invincible until the F-6F Hellcat arrived to defeat it. The Zero's early dominance rested on three things stacked together: superbly trained veteran pilots with hundreds or thousands of flight hours, Allied forces that were unprepared, undertrained, and using tactics unsuited to the opponent, and an aircraft optimized for range and turning performance to a degree nobody had anticipated. Its decline rested on a different stack: tactical doctrine that neutralized the turning advantage, radar-directed interception, numerical superiority produced by industrial capacity, and above all the destruction of the pilot corps that had made the aircraft dangerous in the first place. The Hellcat sits in that list. It is one item on it. This failure of analysis recurs everywhere, in business, in sport, in technology. When a dominant position collapses, observers reliably credit whatever new thing appeared around the same time, because a single visible cause is easier to narrate than a diffuse systemic one. The new competitor's product collects the credit that belongs to the incumbent's hollowed-out engineering department. The Hellcat arrived while Japan's fighter arm was already dying of causes that had nothing to do with the Hellcat, and it has been collecting the credit ever since. An account of Japanese fighter aces that stopped at the flying would be dishonest, so this section will not be softened. The forces these men served committed atrocities. That is not a qualifier attached at the end. That is context which was present the entire time. Jim Reardon, the researcher whose work on the Akutan Zero appears earlier in this account, concluded that a Japanese pilot named Shikata likely machine-gunned the crew of a downed PBY in the water. Strafing survivors was never a Japanese monopoly. Allied aircraft famously strafed Japanese survivors in the water at the Bismarck Sea. Both of those facts belong in the same paragraph, and neither one is a defense of the other. Individual chivalry existed alongside systemic brutality without contradiction, because the two operated at different levels. Sakai is reported to have spared a civilian aircraft. The La Aerobatic story, whatever its provenance, spread because it was the kind of thing people believed of these pilots. Those episodes were real features of the culture, and they coexisted with a war that killed civilians in enormous numbers and with a military establishment that treated prisoners and occupied populations with documented cruelty. The romanticization of Japanese fighter pilots in Western popular history has a traceable source. Martin Caden's 1957 treatment of the Sakai material gave English-speaking audiences a sky samurai, and the image has been recycled for 70 years. Modern scholarship reads far more sober. Henry Sakai and Hade and Izawa, working with Christopher Shores, produced work that is quieter, more heavily qualified, and considerably less flattering to the legend. The pilots in this story were extraordinarily skilled and mostly very young, and they were also instruments of a war of aggression. Holding both of those facts at once is not a compromise position. It is the accurate one. Saburo Sakai lived 55 years after the war ended. Buddhism and pacifism came to him, along with a vow never again to kill a living thing, including a mosquito. Sakai was also unsparing about the war's leadership. Speaking to the Associated Press in August 2000, the veteran said that the closer you get to the emperor, the fuzzier everything gets, and asked who had given the orders for that stupid war. In a 1994 interview with the Daily Telegraph in London, quoted later in his New York Times obituary, Sakai said that over 3 million died fighting for the emperor, but that when the war was over the emperor pretended it was not his responsibility. Equal clarity went to the men on the other side. Sakai said in 2000 that he prayed every day for the souls of his enemies as well as his comrades, and that everyone had done their best for their respective countries. Sakai died on the 22nd of September 2000 in Tokyo, at the age of 84, of a heart attack, which struck while he was dining at Atsugi Naval Air Station, leaning across the table to shake the hand of an American officer. The others went at intervals. Iwamoto in 1955, Akamatsu in 1980, Kawato in 2001, Kashiide in 2003, Anabuki in 2005. Of the 10,939 Zeros built, few survive. Static examples sit in museums and a small number remain flyable. The instruments salvaged from Koga's aircraft are held at the National Museum of the United States Navy, with fragments at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and the Alaska Heritage Museum. Only one complete Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu survives anywhere, at the Smithsonian, and it does not fly. Jim Reardon led a search on Akutan in 1988 for the grave of Tadayoshi Koga. The body had been reburied on Adak Island in 1947, and the remains were most likely repatriated afterwards to the Kidoriga-Fuchi National Cemetery in Japan. The Yokurin Peace Memorial Museum stands at Ami, in Ibaraki, on the ground where the boys were selected. 240,000 boys entered the Yokurin. 24,000 reached the front as pilots. Almost none of the best of them lived to see 1946. Hiromichi Shinohara died at 26 in a border war his country lost. Junichi Sasai died at Rabaul in 1942. Takeo Okamura died before the sword arrived. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa died in the back of somebody else's aircraft at 24. Shoichi Sugita died on a runway at 20. Naoshi Kano died 14 days before the surrender. Tetsuzo Iwamoto survived the war and died 10 years later at 38, telling his wife that he wanted to fly again. Saburo Sakai outlived them all by half a century and spent much of it saying that the top Japanese pilots had been left in combat to die. The victory totals will never be settled. No system existed to settle them with, and no system was ever going to exist, because the organization that produced these men did not consider the individual worth recording. That was not an oversight. It was the same principle that kept them flying until they were killed, expressed in paperwork instead of blood. What survives is smaller and more durable than a number, a design specification that traded armor for range, a training pipeline that ran in one direction only, a handful of aircraft in museums, a set of instruments in a display case in Washington, and a memorial museum at Ami standing where 240,000 boys once sat the examination. The men called the Sky Samurai were the best trained fighter pilots in the world in 1941, and the system that made them that good was the same system that ensured almost none of them would survive being that good. That is the story, not the scores.